Thank you very much. Thank you to Abby. I'm one of those people, I was just struck that I have a will, but I don't have written details of what to do when I die. I do have details about what to do for all my animals. So that leads me on to what I'm going to be talking with you this morning about. So to continue the death theme, I'm also one of those people who talk about death quite a lot. I'm going to look at bereavement in animal owners. There's very limited but interesting evidence about this. I'm a mental health nurse and I've worked in the NHS for 40 years nearly. I'm also a welfare volunteer for a national equine welfare charity, and I've undertaken some research into the hoarding of animals by humans. And yes, hoarding. People hoard animals. That's another story for another day. So I've been really fascinated for many, many years as a mental health nurse and working with animals about the relationships that we humans have with animals. And what happens when they die is part of that relationship. And the loss of my very special horse, after 27 years together, made me focus even more on this particular area. So, humans and animals. Humans have formed relationships with animals for thousands of years. There are differences between simple ownership and attachment and emotional involvement with animals. More than half of UK households have an animal or more than one companion animal, and sometimes several species within them. I'll just have a show of hands. Who here has got an animal at home? Oh, look at that. That's more than 50% by my guesses anyway. Our animals can be considered as our family and maybe as our friends. Many people involve animals in celebrations. Some may involve them in sort of things like Christmas, buying them presents. And some people, there's some nods, okay. We've got that sort of audience, great. And also some people will do little songs and dances for their animals. That's just a bit weird, we'll move on. Okay. Jack Woolley, some of you will remember Jack Woolley, he would always make sure that his dog Captain had Christmas dinner. I came across this list of dogs in 1964. Have we got that many in the Archers in 2019? I'll let you do the adding up in your heads. One of the recommendations from a fantastic paper last year entitled Heavy Petting was, oh yes, it was fab, I loved that. I watched it on YouTube. Was that one of the recommendations was that we needed more animals and more species in the Archers. I'd agree. That gives me an opportunity to have more grief and death and stuff like that. Okay, so the research tells us that those of us, lots of us in the room, who form close bonds with animals tend to be seen as doing so instead of having relationships with people. And we are suspected of being unable to engage satisfactorily with others. But I'm pleased to tell you that this is not the case, as most who are close to their animals are generally sociable, loving, and able to build relationships with other people. So breathe a sigh of relief in here. And generally this is heard in the Archers. So animals are very important to many of us, and when they die there's going to be an impact. For some this is as bad as when a close human dies, and for some of us it's even worse. The experience of grief when there is a loss of a fellow important human being is well documented. And there is less in the literature though for what happens, and less understanding about what happens for when we lose an animal. What research there is shows that the type of death for an animal that the animal experiences can have different effects on the humans who care about them. And this might be quite surprising, but those who chose euthanasia for their animals generally have significant closer attachments to those animals and then go on to report significantly less grief, which is quite interesting, than if their animals had died of natural causes or from accidents. Owners whose animals died in accidents had extended grief reactions. You might remember when Ed shot Will's dog Baz. His dog being shot would have had a bigger impact for Will, perhaps than if he'd had the animal put to sleep himself at some stage. And that's without the ongoing issues between Ed and Will. So, it's not just those who have companion animals. We're talking about a farming community here. Grief at the loss of an animal or animals also affects those who own or work with animals, those who work in animal welfare and also in wildlife sectors. We might think about Kirsty here. This is difficult for some people to understand, especially around farmers, that farmers may experience grief when they're perhaps producing animals for slaughter. In the Archers, this was perhaps demonstrated by the Grundys. We're used to the details of the killing and the plucking and the dressing in the run-up to Christmas. But not all turkeys are the same. A turkey destined for the Christmas table in 1989 was given the name Clint and a reprieve by a then young Will Grundy. And in 2014, George named one turkey Lucky. For farmers and those who breed animals, animals are a source of income. But the significance for individuals is not diminished. The relationships may be different, but many hold the welfare and well-being of their animals as very important. Attachments are still formed, as demonstrated by some farmed animals being given names, and we certainly hear about that in the Archers. We've already heard about Otto, the bull who attacked Tony, and Pepper, of course, Ed's ram. Jazza. Jazza can sometimes be heard talking very lovingly about his sows or his girls. He also has other lady friends, but we won't go into that. I was interested in the cat, the version yesterday, the black one, for Hilda Ogden. So the very nature of lifespans being different for humans and most animals means that people will very often outlive their animals, often many times over. An example of this is perhaps Peggy and her succession of cats, and some people might like to see Hilda Ogden go quicker than her average expected feline lifespan. Different types of loss can give rise to different types of grief experiences. I'm going to talk you through a few of those next. So anticipatory loss. This is where an owner or a keeper knows that an animal will die or will need to be euthanized at some point. And Bartleby. When Bartleby was ailing before Jem arrived, Joe was probably considering the worst outcome at that time and may well have been experiencing anticipatory loss. I'd suggest that this was probably made a little bit more complex by it probably linking to Joe's own mortality and thus making it more complicated. Luckily, Jem turned up and gave Bartleby company and things perked up. When we think about our animals dying, that anticipatory loss can be helpful though. It's painful, but it can forewarn us of what is to happen. And we may then experience less grief when the animal does die. This is one of the trickiest ones. Ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss can be caused by the separation from an animal, perhaps due to a relationship breakup, by moving accommodation, by having to give the animal up due to an inability to keep it or to afford it anymore, or perhaps from theft or the animal becoming lost. The not knowing what has happened to an animal can complicate the grief reaction, and people may spend time ruminating about what's happened and what could have been done differently. Scruff was an example of this when he went missing in the flood, and Linda and Robert didn't know what had happened to him. They didn't know if he was dead or not. And then Scruff showed up at Christmas, and then the next year he died peacefully, asleep in the garden. According to the research, Linda and Robert could have had difficult and prolonged grief reactions when he died of natural causes. But I'd suggest that Linda is often pragmatic when the chips are down, and she'd already dealt with the ambiguous loss of Scruff. And perhaps she was able to deal with this second loss of the same animal with ease. Disenfranchised grief. This links back to the relationships that many of us have with animals and those bonds that we have with them. Those bonds often aren't recognised by others or by society. Therefore, when an animal dies, others underestimate or don't understand the impact and the subsequent grief response for someone. Worse still, people may be ridiculed for their feelings and may feel that they have to hide their grief from friends, from work colleagues, and even from their family. Well-meaning but unhelpful, if not downright painful comments can be made, such as, "It was only an animal," or "You can get another one." We certainly wouldn't say that to somebody who just lost a human. So, yeah. We never heard, I think, that Henry and Helen had animals at the time that Rob was around. I may stand corrected on that one. Helen's pony Comet isn't mentioned now, so I presume, luckily, wasn't part of her life when Rob showed up. But I'd suggest if they had had an animal or animals, Rob may well have used it to manipulate and hurt Helen, as many abused women report that partners have threatened to harm or to get rid of their animals, or have actually harmed or killed them, and sometimes that's done in front of them and the children. So women often stay in abusive relationships due to their fears about theirs, and very commonly the fears that they have about their children's animals. So going back to farmers, in the UK we've had a number of events in recent years that have hit farmers hard. The last foot and mouth epidemic in 2001 saw 6 million cows and sheep killed. The ongoing issues of tuberculosis in cattle, we sometimes hear about TB in the Archers. The floods in recent years in other areas as well as Borchester. And some farmers may have bred certain family lines for several human generations, especially dairy farmers. And the culling out or loss of herds can be very hard to bear for some farmers and for other workers involved. They may develop symptoms of trauma or even PTSD, and there are cases of suicidal acts and thoughts. The loss of the herd for Pat and Tony was difficult, and the sale of the herd and the resulting quietness of the farm was hard for them. And those who keep livestock also keep working and companion animals, so there's a whole mix here. So there are different levels of attachment and meaning in each case. Topper's death last year was a bit of a find for me for this presentation. Abby's already mentioned Topper. He was Nigel Pargett's horse, and after Nigel's death was sold to Shula. He was put down at the end of July 2018 as an emergency due to liver failure. Shula lied and told Elizabeth that Topper went very peacefully, when in fact it was an emergency and it was traumatic. The euthanasia of large animals is different to small animals. It is often traumatic, it is often difficult, and it is often risky. Shula acknowledged that Topper was a linking object. He was a link for Freddie to his father. And this is often the case in the loss of an animal. They can be a link to other humans who have died or who are no longer in that individual's life. Unresolved grief can be triggered for that lost human when their animal dies at a later date. There can be further issues, which is quite interesting, if an animal dies from the same or similar disease to which the human died. And so ritual is an important part of the process after death. There is a lack of rituals after an animal dies, which can compound problems and any disenfranchised grief that somebody may be experiencing. The loss of large animals, or a large animal, brings further problems and possibly trauma. Again, Topper demonstrated this issue. Using the hunt for disposal of the body was suggested. He would have been used as food for the hounds. Seen as appropriate, I know, but that's the reality. This is seen as appropriate for a horse who's hunted. But Freddie wanted him buried at Lower Loxley, and the difficulty of burying horses was acknowledged. So what can help us as animal owners when the inevitable happens? There's a number of things that we can do, very simple things, or we can support others when they've lost an animal. And these can help with the grief process. Keeping a transitionary object, either something belonging to the animal or some part of the animal, such as ashes, fur clippings, a piece of mane or tail. Writing perhaps, poems, journals or memory books. Making albums, framing photographs, having a portrait drawn or painted. Planting commemorative plants or trees. Ceremonies of scattering ashes, of remembering. And commemorative events. My friend and vet sends me a text on the anniversary of the day my horse went. She's a good friend. You know where I'm going with this one. So, I'm going to be a bit controversial here. At a time when the Grundy family was struggling, Joe took it upon himself to kill his beloved ferrets. He bludgeoned them to death with a hammer. How dreadful and shocking was that episode? But then again, you may not know this, but many vets want to and do put their own animals to sleep themselves. They want to do that last one important thing for their animal, and they want to be the ones that do it. So was Joe that much different? Maybe not the best way of doing it. I wouldn't condone bludgeoning your loved ones to death with a hammer, but I just want to make that clear. But you can see where I'm going with that one. And poor Alistair. Poor Alistair. Vets statistically deal with death much more than those of us working in human health. It's a repetitive and frequent occurrence, on average, I think, about 4 times a week for a vet. Yeah, it's a lot. Vets and veterinary staff, it gets more complicated. They're often affected by the death of animals, their own and other people's. They have to manage the animal, its welfare, but also what's going on for the owners around them. Staff may build significant relationships with animals and their owners, often over many years, and often experience their own grief when an animal dies. When my old horse was put to sleep, my vet and friend, and the veterinary nurse that she brought along with her, and I all sat on the grass afterwards when he'd gone. We sat with him, and we all cried and talked. Vets often work and live in the same communities, as demonstrated by Alistair. He has relationships with many of those in Ambridge, both professionally and personally. This could make his experiences of death of the animals he cares for much more complex, especially when he's experiencing other losses in his life as well. Animals are important to many of us, including those in the Archers. The death of an animal is a real bereavement and should be treated as such. Our relationships should be recognised and honoured. So we've been thinking about endings, and I want to tell you also about beginnings. Over 4 years ago, my beloved horse Badger, this is he, pictured here, this was just a couple of weeks before the planned event, and he was put to sleep by my good friend vet. It was a really difficult experience, but it did lead me to becoming and developing my interest in the relationships that humans have with animals, and then I started looking at bereavement. And this ending led me to publishing some papers with my friend and vet on this subject, and also to being here today. So I'll just give you this last slide. Thank you very much.
I find that more moving.
That one there, yeah, I find that more moving and hard to listen to than the previous paper. I can't have a pet because I travel all the time, live in most accommodation. And every time I see a dog or a cat, I just have this pang of that kind of ambiguous loss.
Yeah.
But I cried, when Scruff died, I cried so hard because I was like vicariously a dog owner through the grief that I have looking at a dog. Anyway, any questions?
I've set some people off.
Yeah.
Can I just say, as a mental health nurse, I have to make at least 4 people a week cry, so thank you, I've got one there. Anybody else that I can...
My thing's a comment really rather than a question. When you talked about domestic abuse and animals being killed, I do interviews, risk assessment interviews with women who've been abused. 24 questions, and number 18 is always, has there an animal been killed? And I feel myself tensing. And I also feel bad about it because, the woman has suffered, but if an animal's been hurt or killed, I just shiver inside really. Yeah. And then, you spoke about that. It's hard.
There's two great papers, I think, from out of Ireland about this, and I've probably got the references up there, but yeah, absolutely amazing. It's stuff that's just hidden about the impact and the way that abusers will keep women and others, other genders are available in there as well, so yeah.
I think it's nearer the surface, really, grief about an animal. It's somehow easier.
Women will sometimes present, and others will present to animals to vets with unexplained injuries. So that's something to look out for as well. So it's not just about death, it's the threats of. Yeah.
I was just struck by what Carla said about the death of Scruff, and I remember reading years ago that Billy Baxter wanted a pet on Blue Peter for all of the children who couldn't have pets, so they could kind of have a virtual pet. And I'm just wondering for how many people the pets on the Archers are their own pet.
Yeah.
Hello. We had a cocker spaniel for nearly 14 years who we had to put to sleep in November. And a couple of weeks later I received a letter from my insurance company offering me bereavement counselling. And I felt I didn't need it because I was having really good support from friends and family anyway. But that letter arrived on the day that it was on the news that people who are inadvertently caught up in a terrorist attack and injured are not receiving bereavement counselling. And I found that very shocking.
Yeah.
Very shocking.
I'll come over, don't worry. One more question.
Your talk has really fascinated me because I have suspected this anyway, but the fact that my parents had 2 cats put down in my absence while I was a child and said, don't worry, you can get another one, I think has meant I've never become close to a cat since. And I just worked that out.
Just, bless you. Yeah, and I was thinking about Abby talking about involving children, and that's all the guidance around, vets are really good usually at talking to kids about this stuff, and involve the kids in this, but bless you.
Thank you.
You're welcome, thank you.
Carry on, our team.